Well, I want to thank you again for tuning in today to our virtual church gathering. We are absolutely thrilled to be connecting with you here online. And as we continue to feel the effects of this coronavirus challenge that's going on around the world, I want to take a moment to say thank you, especially to our essential workers, to all of the people who are out on the front lines trying to provide necessary services to our communities. I know that there are people watching this message who are working in public service and healthcare and essential retail and so many other fields, and we are so thankful. The rest of us are so thankful for your courage in the midst of this challenge that we're facing. It wasn't that long ago that I served as a chaplain working in one of our local hospitals, and one of the frequent responsibilities of that job was to complete these online training modules as they were assigned to us. But the training wasn't specifically about chaplaincy. It was training that every hospital employee had to complete so that we would all be ready in the event that something unusual happened. So, for example, we had regular training about what to do in the case of severe weather. We had training about what to do if a reporter approached us and asked about a particular patient at the hospital, maybe a celebrity who was under our care. We had training about what to do if someone came onto campus carrying a weapon. In fact, we even had to come in once a year and be fitted and trained for how to use a mask that was called an N95 respirator. And at the time, I didn't know much about that, but we've heard a bunch about them on the news lately. And you know, I worked in that hospital for over 7 years, never faced a situation where I needed to wear my N95, but every 12 months I got retrained on how to use one just in case. Now, you've been through some just-in-case training in your life too. Training that prepared you for the potential of a dangerous situation or an unexpected turn of events, maybe on the job or in your school. The most common one we're all familiar with is a fire drill, right? In fact, it's a requirement in all of our schools that they conduct fire drills on a regular basis to make sure that everyone knows how to exit the building in a safe, efficient manner. And thank goodness, most students will go through their entire academic careers without ever experiencing a fire in their school building. But we understand that these drills are still important because they're a preventative measure. Because here's what we know. We know that in an emergency, when we're in a scary situation or a confusing moment, we typically revert to our learned behaviors, right? We do what comes naturally. And that's exactly why it's important to train ahead of time for those moments. Because if we just do what comes naturally, some of those problems could actually be made worse. I mean, how many times have you watched a scary movie where the bad guy gets into the house and the teenagers he's chasing run upstairs trying to get away? Why'd they do that? Because that's what came natural to them. Or maybe you've heard that if you're out in the woods and you cross paths with a mountain lion, you're not supposed to turn and run, even though that might be exactly what comes naturally to you. But that's likely to make that animal start chasing you. And so the experts say you have to train yourself to respond differently when you encounter one of those animals. In fact, the goal of most training is to rewire or override our natural responses in favor of trained responses to keep ourselves out of trouble. Now, we've been facing this coronavirus disruption for a while now. In fact, this is the 6th weekend that we've been unable to meet in person as a church. 6 weeks of this strange, interrupted version of life. And there's something significant about that length of time. I've noticed that we're sort of at a pivotal moment now that we're this far into this new rhythm of our lives. We're at a strange mile marker, because we're still close enough to the past that we can vividly remember the parts that we miss the most, like being able to run errands without wearing a mask or being able to have dinner with friends at a restaurant. But we're also far enough away from that that this is starting to become our new normal. And with this normal comes this bizarre set of feelings: instability, insecurity, anxiety, uncertainty. And those make us sometimes desperate for comfort and familiarity, partly because we don't know when this new normal is going to end. And in the meantime, we're dealing with some unsettling truths about our reality. Now, there's a story in the Bible that I want us to look at together today, and it's about a group of people who found themselves in a similar position. They were stuck in a season of waiting. And when we pick up their story, interestingly, they've been marooned with their new normal for about 6 weeks. And they're wrestling with some feelings that might sound familiar to a lot of us: instability, insecurity, anxiety, and uncertainty. And all of that has cobbled together to make them desperate for comfort. Now, this story comes from the ancient history of the Israelites, soon after they'd been liberated from slavery to the Egyptians. This is the story that you may have seen portrayed in movies like The Ten Commandments and The Prince of Egypt. And the theme of the story is that God constantly, consistently provided for the people of Israel while they were traveling through desert territory toward the land that they would eventually inhabit. God provided food and water and direction throughout the day and night, leadership, and even defended them from attackers out there in the desert. And soon after that, God invited the people of Israel into a special covenant relationship. Through his messenger Moses, God told the Israelites that if they would trust God, obey God, stay true to this covenant, then God would continue to protect and lead and provide for them and give them a special position, a special responsibility to represent God to the rest of the world. And the very first thing God insisted on, the very first condition of the covenant, was that the people were not to worship anything or anybody else besides God. Now, it's hard for you and me to relate to the worldview of a primitive culture like theirs, with thousands of years and thousands of miles that separate us. But the Israelite people in that time, they were familiar with all sorts of gods. Having just come out of Egypt, they worshipped statues and images and officials because of their supposed control over agriculture and fertility and commerce or natural disasters. But out in the desert, God demanded that they reject any other deities, the idols, the images, the statues, everything. And the people agreed. I mean, after all, they had seen this new God protect them from so much already. But it didn't take long for the story to go south. You see, God told Moses to ascend Mount Sinai to receive the rest of the instructions and laws that would be the terms of their covenant. And Moses ended up being gone for nearly 6 weeks. And during that time, the people got anxious. And they weren't sure whether Moses was coming back or whether God had abandoned them or what was happening. And so, according to Exodus chapter 32, the people of Israel reverted to their old ways. They did what they were used to. They did what came naturally to them. They decided to worship something else. And so they approached Moses' brother, Aaron, with a request. But you've got to see it to realize just how ridiculous this request really was. Here's what they said to Moses' brother, Aaron. They said, "Come on, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt." Now, you can understand why they're a little anxious. I mean, it's been 6 weeks of waiting, 6 weeks of limbo, 6 weeks of uncertainty and insecurity and wondering, is this how it all ends? Lost and aimless in the desert? But the part that ought to make us think twice is that once they decided that God had abandoned them, they decided that they could simply create new gods for themselves. And that's exactly what Aaron did. He took all of their gold jewelry and melted it down and sculpted the gold into a statue of a cow. It was a divine DIY project. They opted to build something, an idol, so that they could trust it and worship it and follow it and depend on it. And to us, that all seems foolish and archaic. I mean, you don't have to follow that logic very far to realize that if humans can make it, it can't have supernatural origin or power, right? I mean, by definition, it can't truly be equal to a god. And the idea of sculpting a statue and then giving that statue authority over you seems like an irrelevant suggestion to our modern Western minds. But the reality is, idolatry was never about the statues. And idolatry wasn't just an ancient problem in more primitive cultures. The reality is that Idolatry is a pervasive theme throughout the entirety of human history. It shows up in virtually every book of the Bible. Sometimes it shows up in the form of people worshiping statues, but the statues are beside the point. Because, statue or not, idolatry is what happens when we give our allegiance to anything or anyone besides the one true God. And when you use that definition, you discover that almost anything can become an idol for us if we allow it. In fact, when we use that definition, we discover that idolatry isn't just one sin among a list of many. Idolatry is the one sin at the root of all the other sins. Idolatry isn't just an issue that stands in the way of following God. Idolatry is the issue. It's about allowing something else to take God's proper place of power in our lives. It's about giving something or somebody else higher priority. It's about being so devoted to something else that God becomes an afterthought. We might make an idol out of the goal or the person or the habit that we turn to when we feel like our world is spinning out of control. An idol could show up in the form of a project or a hobby or a career that we pour ourselves into, heart and soul. It's easy to make idols out of feelings like comfort, security, love, respect, and power. In fact, we can make idols out of a lot of things that aren't even wrong in and of themselves. Martin Luther, the German theologian who launched the Reformation in the 16th century, said, "Anything on which your heart relies and depends is really your God." And if we're honest with ourselves, I think most of us would admit that we sometimes allow our hearts and our happiness to largely depend on temporary factors and circumstances. Now, of course, it doesn't help that we live in a culture that has made an art form out of convincing us that our lives are missing something, right? I mean, you can hardly turn around without seeing an advertisement with some limited time offer or a new and improved product that promises to make life better. But idolatry isn't a matter of the culture around us. Idolatry is a matter of the heart inside of us. Idolatry is a matter of priorities. It's a matter of perspective. It's about giving a created thing the credit that the Creator deserves. It's about mistakenly believing that something I can achieve or something I can experience or control can give me what I really need and what I really want. Idolatry is the result of letting something else take God's rightful place at the center of our lives. And we rarely do this on purpose, but it's so easy to let it happen. But God is calling us to be on the lookout, to watch out for this, and to do something about it. After all, this was the very first commandment that God gave to His people. So here's what we're going to do. Today's message is an introduction to a series of messages that we're going to share about modern-day idols. We're calling this series Trapped because our tendency is for our idols to ensnare us and trick us into giving them our full allegiance. And over the next few weeks, we're going to consider some of the pursuits and the passions that have the greatest tendency to become idols for people like you and me. We're going to try to get to the root of this problem. But we're not going to just talk about the problems. We're going to talk about the freedom from idolatry that's possible when we live our lives in pursuit of Jesus. And we're going to talk about how keeping God in the right place in our hearts actually makes the rest of our lives better. So I hope you'll tune in next Sunday. And until then, may the Lord bless you, and may you have a wonderful week.